Good morning. I am Maria Cadbury, the MD of Persollo in the UK, and I have the pleasure of speaking with Liz Duff and Matt Rogerson on the subject of what can the UK learn from Australia's proposal for media to boycott Google and Facebook to force them to pay for the news. Now, first up, before we get into this really interesting conversation, I'd like to hand over to Liz and Matt to introduce themselves, and then we can dive into the subject. Matt, over to you.
Hi there, I'm Matt Rogerson. I'm Director of Public Policy at Guardian Media Group, which is the publisher of the Guardian Observer and Guardian.com.
Thank you. Liz.
Hiya, morning. I'm Liz Duff. I'm Head of Media and Investment at Total Media. And Total Media are a media agency that uses behavioural science to connect brands to people. And we do that through a really deep understanding of how people actually really think, feel and act.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, so the topic of situation at hand is that Rupert Murdoch's newspaper business in Australia has said more than 100 of its newspapers will become digital only or disappear entirely. This comes hot on the heels of the Australian government instructing the Australian competition watchdog ACCC to develop the mandate code amid the steep decline in advertising, which could effectively prevent Facebook and Google from using news unless they share ad news. In this session, we will ask whether this is the right approach and could it work in the UK. Now, first off, we have hot on the heels news literally just released this morning. Google strikes a deal to pay for news in 4 countries. Now, this is shortly after they had rejected it. Facebook has recently rejected it, and now they're doing a deal. Right, Matt, over to you. What's your opinion on the situation?
Yeah, it's exactly. Good planning on your part, I think. Yeah, I think you need to see the ACCC discussions and the Google announcement today on a kind of continuum, which is these are discussions that have been going on for many years. Google first paid publishers in Europe. They paid publishers in France. Back in 2013, there was a fund that was set up by Google to pay publishers for content that was used in search. They did that through a kind of innovation fund, so it's slightly less direct. I think what's been announced this morning is Google paying publishers directly to appear within a specific Google app. So it's not going to be paying people to appear in Google as they do at the moment, but a kind of confined specific app. So it's slightly different from what the ACCC is trying to achieve. The ACCC is trying to force Google to license and pay publishers to appear in search and with the existing products that they have. Google's taken a slightly different approach, but they've done this before. They had an app where they shared revenue with publishers through advertising within that app a few years ago. They stopped that and moved to a different approach, but it's positive that they're moving this direction.
Okay, that's brilliant. It does feel like they're making a step towards it, which is great. Liz, how do you feel from the agency perspective?
Yeah, I think obviously the news today is changes things a little bit, but I think what the news today is, it's going to be interesting to see if that changes Facebook's stance as well, because sort of their reaction to the ACCC report was very much like, well, if you try and charge us for this, we're just going to take away the news content. I think as Google seemed to be sort of taking a bit more of a sort of engaging with the situation a bit more, it'll be interesting sort of to see what happens in the market. But I think broadly, sort of the overall decision wasn't surprising, but it will be disappointing for the news providers. But I don't think it was ever sort of the solution to the much bigger problem of sort of how we finance quality journalism. And I think, if the news publishers were expecting a decision on this to sort of just mean there's a sudden free flow of money coming from Facebook and Google to them, I think that was never really going to happen. I think the bigger issue to be looking into, and it's one we've been, talking about in the publishing industry for years, and on the agency side and on the publisher side, is much more around sort of the models that are there in the market. And as revenue is disappearing and going to other platforms, it's how do the publishers sort of properly monetize their content so that they can keep sort of providing that support for the quality journalism that agencies want, brands want, and it's in the public interest to have.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. It's really interesting when you talk about actually the modelling, because actually speaking with Matt from a publisher's point of view, you'd mentioned about, there's a bigger argument out there about licensing. thinking about that as a broader argument, what is the Guardian's approach to licensing?
Yeah, I agree with much of what Liz has said, but I think there is an important point here, which is that news publishers already license content to a number of apps today. So the commercial licensing of journalism happens every day with news publishers large and small, whether it's kind of to a super aggregator information service like Nexus or new emerging apps like Smart News. There are commercial agreements between those aggregators of news content and publishers that see finance flowing back. And yeah, it's absolutely true that money is not going to suddenly replace, sales lost at the newsstand or advertising revenues that move away. But absolutely, it's part of a diverse revenue base that publishers can use to fund journalism going forward. So I think there's a bit of a misconception with The Guardian where people think because you can access journalism on our site and it's open for consumers, it's open for all, that means that journalism is free. Well, that's not the case. I mean, when a consumer goes to theguardian.com, they agree to a set of terms and conditions. They include viewing advertising on that site. There are paid for products that we provide, whether it's the digital news app or a digital subscription. Where it's a commercial user of our content, there are very clear licensing and syndication guidelines that those commercial users have to abide by, and they have to negotiate with our licensing team wherever they use Guardian journalism. So, licensing is a core part of what publishers do today, and hopefully it will be going forward over the next few years.
Nice. It's a very clever model. I think it's really interesting when you look at the multifaceted side of what you're doing. Thank you on that, and understand a bit more about The Guardian. Let's move on and have a little look about Facebook's response. Basically, they said they will not be paying publishers for their news, and ultimately, the publishers needed Facebook more than Facebook needed the publishers. That news content is highly substitutable. Matt, what do you feel like? Do you feel Zuckerberg values news publishers?
Well, you'd have to ask him that. But I mean, I think from the actions of Facebook over the past few years, you would think not. And look, I think they've always had an issue with the mix of content they have on their platform, and I think they're going to come under a lot of pressure over the next few months about some of the decisions they're making in the US about what they host on their platform. Certainly in countries in Europe, what we have in place in this country is where you have major media platforms, you have media regulation, and that's based on the idea that we think news is good and it's a public good, and that it should be prominent within large platforms where people spend a lot of time. And again, I'm despite my relatively young but aging looks, I remember there was a report in the House of Lords Communications Committee a few years ago looking at media plurality, which is one of the kind of key bits of legislation that governs media ownership and distribution in this country. And even then, they were talking about, I think it was 5 years ago, they were talking about kind of Facebook and Google potentially being included within that framework so that you can see what the type of news, what the volume of news, what the sources are that are propagating on those platforms. And now that didn't come to pass. But I think if you're in a situation where a platform like Facebook is saying we don't care about news, it does raise bigger questions. And I think those will get louder in the months and years to come, especially if they do boycott the ACCC process in the way that they've suggested.
Yeah, I think that's really sound and actually really interesting, and it is something to watch as we move forward. Liz, you had quite a few thoughts on this when we were chatting. What can take us through what you were thinking?
Yeah, I think the key there is sort of Facebook's response was sort of the typically bullish sort of response you might expect, but it doesn't entirely ring true to me, I suppose. I mean, in terms of sort of the value of news publishers, I still believe they are massively, massively valuable, and that's sort of why their long-term future is so important. And I think the current COVID-19 situation has only really demonstrated that. There's been increases of readership. We've seen once again sort of how vital news brands are sort of to our society. So for Facebook to say sort of they don't really care about that content, it sort of doesn't ring true to me. And I think regardless of what Google or Facebook or similar might say, I think there definitely is a value exchange for both sort of the digital platforms and the news providers. And I think, you know, coming from like Facebook's stance, we know the digital platforms are valuable to the publishers. And I think I was looking at some of the stats from Australia, and, you know, over like a third of Australian consumers access their news through social media. Over a quarter of them use search engines to search for news brands. So you can kind of see why Facebook and Google are saying they need us, but we don't need them. But I don't actually agree that sort of the publishers haven't got a leg to stand on here, because, you know, if their content wasn't valuable to the social platforms, you know, they're not charities. They wouldn't be putting that content up there or sort of licensing it if it's not valuable to their audiences. And I think as audiences diversify where they look for their news from, they're going to expect to see it on the sort of all platforms. So it needs to be sort of a real value exchange between sort of everyone in that market. But I think what Matt said is really key about sort of getting a level playing field and sort of that sense of plurality, I can't say that word, plurality, and having sort of, you know, not what one rule for one platform and another rule for another one.
That's spot on. Really good. Thank you. So, right, I read something. I read in the social media today that the whole stance by the Australian government, it's all about optics, right? Being seen to be taking action, even if it costs money and time and effort, all for political stunt. So, from another point of view, they're saying this is what the Australian government's proposal to make Google and Facebook pay news publishers for the usage of their content feels like a political posturing. Do you think this is an optics situation, or is this a true regulation argument? Matt, what issues have you identified? Tell me.
So yeah, look, as I've said, I think wherever aggregators aggregate professional news content around the world today, there is a commercial licensing agreement in place. You know, the way in which an aggregator monetizes a service that they provide is really up to them. But ultimately, if they're using an input such as professional journalism to create a service and monetize that service, then there needs to be kind of some system in place. So I think what the ACCC is really trying to do is say they recognize that fact and are saying, actually, at the moment, the imbalance of power between platforms and publishers is such that competition authorities need to engage in that and to set the parameters of discussion in a way that there is an actual discussion between the two parties rather than one party being told what to do by the other. And that's not uncommon in other sectors. I mean, in this country, you have the competition authorities have in the past looked at areas like the supermarket sector, where you have very large companies, you've got concentrations of power, and they have to negotiate the relationships between those two parties. In this sector, in the digital economy, that is even more acute in terms of you have one or two companies which govern basically the whole of the digital economy. So what you see in Australia, I mean, it's not isolated. You have action going on in the UK, you have action in France, in Germany, a big ruling this week from the German Supreme Court against Facebook about their use of personal data and invasions of consumer privacy. You know, you have issues in the US. So the ACCC is not atypical in taking this position. It's part of a much broader trend, which is effectively competition regulators getting to grips with what has become an increasingly concentrated digital economy.
Brilliant, thank you. So it's not really about the optics, is it? There is a broader action being taken, which is great. Liz, what's your take on it?
I totally agree with that, actually, and I think it would be a massive piece of work. I'd look at the report; it's huge. It would be a massive piece of work to do just for the optics. But yeah, I totally agree. It's about the broader issue about the need for tighter regulation, and what I suspect is sort of it's, as Matt said, it's the first step to sort of better regulating the industry. It's not necessarily the answer, and it needs to be more of a collaborative approach. But yeah, I see it very much as a gateway to broader conversations about a different type of regulation in the industry. I think that the interesting thing actually was the Australian government have said, you know, even if it was rejected, they've chosen to push forward with sort of their proposal and the report. So if it is just for optics, it sort of looks like they're committed to it in the long haul. But I sense it is, as I said, sort of an opening to talk about regulation on a sort of more general basis.
Great, thank you. And actually, I'll pose this one to Matt, actually, the next one, which is like looking at the ACC Digital Platforms Inquiry, which is where this all stems from. What else stood out from the report to you?
Well, I think the code of practice they landed on. I think the fact that's been, I was a little bit involved with the Cairncross review that came out in the UK. I think it was two or 3 years ago now. I was on the little advisory panel that helped with that report, and they also suggested a code of practice. The Furman review in the UK will also do the same thing. I expect the CMA will say the same thing in the UK. So for me, one thing that stood out was the unanimity of views coming out from all of these different reports suggesting there does need to be codes of practice to regulate the relations. I mean, the other big issue that Liz will be aware of, just from an agency perspective, from an advertising perspective, is the ACCC dug into ad tech and the opacity in the digital ad market. And that's a kind of massive focus at the moment for regulators, again, around the world, just in terms of the money that's taken out from advertiser through to publisher and where that money's going. Is it going on fraud or being taken out by intermediaries? I think that was a big focus of the ACCC report, and they've got another report coming out, a subsequent ad tech report, which is really, really important. So I think those two areas, plus the issue of data protection, I think this is really, really important, and it will become, there's a European Commission report about GDPR and the progress of implementing that came out this week. I think the ACCC found that the federal data protection laws in Australia just haven't kept up. So I think one of their big recommendations was the creation of a new a version of GDPR for Australia, if you like. And I think the equal enforcement of data protection law against platforms as it is against publishers and other parts of the value chain, that's absolutely vitally important to create a level playing field. What you can't have is platforms being able to use personal data for purposes that consumers don't agree to, in ways that mean that they have a massive advantage in the marketplace in terms of the ability to target granular digital advertising. So, those are three areas I think the ACCC is really locked onto, which are common to many of the inquiries that are going on across the world at the moment.
Yeah, I think that's really astute, which is really interesting. I've obviously got steely eyes on the ad tech one. I'm very curious about that one. Liz, what about you? What are your key takeouts?
Yeah, I pulled out something very similar actually around sort of the reference to the opaque operations of the digital platforms, and sort of the key bit around there was referencing that it's very difficult to sort of determine precisely what standard of behaviours digital platforms are meeting, and it's something that regulators around the world are sort of looking into, and I think it definitely is a precursor to more stricter regulation from the sound of it. I think the other interesting bit to me was the report referencing the fact that although a large part of the inquiry was sort of specifically naming Google and Facebook, they also sort of were really keen to make sure that their recommendations were very forward facing and could be adapted to other digital platforms. So in some ways, I sort of saw that as a bit of a warning shot to others, that just because they're not sort of being named in the threat of the duopoly, that sort of, there are other sort of areas being looked into, if you want to call it a threat, other threats emerging that the regulators sort of aren't going to let slide. I think another sort of interesting part that came out, because as we said, sort of around the world, publishers are facing similar threats, and I think for publishers in the UK, it was about sort of, there was comments that sort of for the continued production for sort of public interest journalism, it's likely in the future to require government assistance. And I think when we again don't want to just talk about COVID, but when we look in the UK at the support that sort of the UK government gave in recent months and spending a huge amount of money on advertising there, it sort of opens up that conversation of, is that something we're going to have to see more in the future, rather than just sort of looking at what licensing, for example, as a way to support the industry.
Absolutely brilliant, really interesting. I think you've really dived into it and taken out some of the really interesting areas that we want to keep our eyes on. Let's move on to the actual Facebook blog. Matt and Liz, I know that we've chatted about this and you've both read it. Matt, what are your thoughts on the Facebook blog itself?
Well, I mean, you've got to set out your position, don't you? I think, as I said earlier on, I think if you believe that news is a public good and it's vital to a democratic society, then it's important to engage in a process in a kind of meaningful way. And I don't necessarily think that blog is particularly suggests that. But this is an ongoing process, and I'm sure these are opening salvos between the platforms as to their positions on this stuff. Ultimately, I think the concern has to be from Facebook. If they're getting more and more criticism for their role in spreading disinformation, and there was obviously the 2016 stuff during the election of Trump, major issues there, took their eye off the ball. They've tried to address some of those issues now. But still today, when I look at some of the surveys that are coming out about where people are getting misinformation about COVID, the idea that 5G masks are spreading COVID, people who get their news from Facebook, I think the stats were like 56% of people who believed in conspiracy theories, their main source of news is Facebook, compared to 20% for people whose main source is not Facebook. So they have massive issues with the content that they're hosting on their platform. And I want to live in I don't know about you, I want to live in a world where rational debate and argument is what ultimately governs the politics of our country. I'm not sure that Facebook does. I think that they may be are more interested in getting attention and advertising than they are about being part of that rational debate, and that's problematic for them. And as I say, the ACCC process is part of this debate, but it's much broader. I mean, in the US, they're talking about kind of changing the liability of these platforms, and that's kind of Trump's saying that, but also kind of more sensible people in Congress are saying that as well. So they're kind of locked into a much bigger debate, I think.
Yeah, I think that's really quite steely and quite astute. Liz, you had similar, but a couple of other points that you were mentioning. Take me through yours.
Yeah, so I think, the crux of it basically is Facebook won't be paying. Both sort of Facebook and Google would survive without that, without news content. And if that's the path that the government wants to force, they'll react to it. And that's sort of it's a typical response from a dominant player that you'd expect. I think I was more interested sort of later in the blog when they sort of seemed to be taking a bit more of a reason in response as well. And sort of once they'd landed that key message around they're not going to be sort of forced sort of down the line, they don't think it's commercially viable to them. They sort of seem to have more content in there to potentially sort of placate the regulators, because they were speaking about sort of their support for a development of a more sensible regulatory framework, which by their terms probably means one that favours them a bit more. But it's more of a reasonable tone, I suppose. And again, what they were doing was highlighting the fact that news content really is only a very small fraction of the content in their average news feed. So, you could see how they would pull that content. But as I said before, sort of on the flip side, it does have value to their consumers. I think the important thing, and it's going back to Matt's point actually, is around the trust. And when you sort of speak to consumers about the level of trust of news content from an official provider versus on a news brand site versus on social media or through sort of online video, that level of trust is much lower. And I think again, the social platforms are aware of this, so they're sort of trying to strike the balance between what works for them, but also being conscious that they need the content.
I think that's really.
I suppose the one interesting point in the rhetorical phrase that's in there from Facebook is the idea that publishers have got outdated business models. And I think what's interesting is if some of the rulings stick that are going on at the moment in Europe, in Germany, as we expect from the CMA, if there's a ruling that actually Facebook's model, the way in which they use personal data, is in breach of GDPR, ironically, it will be Facebook's model that looks out of date and doesn't comply with the legal framework as it is. So they may have bigger issues. They may have bigger issues to address than publishers do at the moment, to be honest.
Well, that's a twist in the tail, Matt. I really like that. We've covered a tremendous amount, and I think we could talk at length for another half an hour, if I'm honest. But we're at the time now where we need to wrap up. So, Matt, let's get our overall thoughts on the whole conversation. And first of all, to you, Matt.
Yeah, so what I would say is that I see this as being part of the continuum. It's this is not a bolt from the blue. This is a debate that's been going on for many years. Licensing of journalism is not a strange thing. It happens every day. I expect these discussions will continue. Let's see what comes out the other side of it. I think what's really, really clear is that the terms and relations between platforms and publishers and consumers actually are going to come under far more scrutiny in the next few years.
Amazing, thank you. Liz, what are your insights and key takeouts?
Yeah, I suppose for me, it's the real key one is about still the continuing need to protect that quality journalism, but also sort of how difficult a challenge that is, and sort of it's definitely one that we can't ignore, sort of as brands, as agencies, or just as consumers, I suppose. What you don't want to do through regulation is sort of limit availability of content. So governments around the world sort of very much need to find a way to protect that quality journalism, but not just regulate it to the extent that they're sort of forcing people to just remove news content, which isn't in anybody's benefit, basically. But I suppose ultimately in the future, there's probably going to be limited choice. It's a very difficult sort of issue to address, but journalism will have to continue to be funded, and whether that's through new business models, through government support, through a sort of a combined approach, or something that we haven't even got to yet. I think the crux of the issue remains that we need to provide that financial support.
Absolutely brilliant and really key takeouts, which I'm quite sure everybody who's listening is going to really, really enjoy. That's us for now. Matt and Liz, thank you very much. That was very insightful and bang on the news with the news flash from the FT this morning. Thank you to everybody who's listening, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Maria.
Thank you.
Thank you.